The woman threw the newspaper advertisement onto the counter so hard the coffee cup rattled. 12 words, she said to no one in particular in the empty Chicago boarding house kitchen at 2 in the morning. He used 12 words to describe what he wants in a wife. She laughed, but it wasn't funny. It was the laugh of a woman who had been measured and dismissed so many times she'd lost count. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. Not because she had hope, because she had nothing left to lose, and 12 words was the most honest offer anyone had made her in 3 years. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to this channel and stay with us until the very last word, because this one does not end the way anyone expects. And drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The train pulled into Caldwell Falls at 6:43 in the morning, and Evelyn Carter, she had decided she was already Evelyn Carter, because the alternative was arriving as no one stepped onto the platform, with one bag $2.14, and the particular kind of calm that only comes from having already survived the worst thing that was ever going to happen to you. She had buried her mother in a Cook County pauper's cemetery 4 months ago. She had been dismissed from her last position the week after, when her employer's wife had looked at Evelyn's capable hands and her unbroken posture and decided that a woman who needed no managing was somehow more threatening than useful. She had spent 11 weeks on a cot behind the laundry room of a boarding house on Halsted Street, ironing other women's silk dresses for coins that didn't add up fast enough to matter. And then she had read 12 words in the back of a newspaper, and she had made a decision the way she made all her decisions, without sentiment, without ceremony, and without looking back. She stepped onto the platform. The silence hit her before anything else. It was not the silence of an empty place. It was the silence of a crowd that has collectively decided not to speak, which is an entirely different thing and far louder. There were perhaps 20 people on that platform in the gray September morning, and every single one of them had turned to look at her, and not one of them said a word. And that particular silence was the sound of a town making up its mind about a woman before she had taken 3 steps on its ground. She had heard that silence before. In Stockholm when her family's money ran out. In Chicago when she arrived with an accent and a name no one wanted to try. She knew exactly what it meant, and she knew exactly what it was designed to do. She kept walking. At the far end of this platform, apart from everyone else, which she immediately understood was not coincidence, stood a man she had never seen, but recognized without difficulty. He was tall, broader through the shoulders than she had expected, with the kind of physicality that came not from pride, but from years of iron and fire remaking a body into something functional. His hair was dark, salted at the temples. His face was the face of a man who had at some point decided that whatever he felt was his own business and no one else's, and had kept to that decision long enough that the decision had become the face. He was watching her approach with the careful attention of a man assessing something he was about to bet on. She stopped in front of him. "Mr. Carter," she said. "Miss Lindqvist," he said. His voice came out low and measured, like a man who had learned to spend words carefully because he'd found out the hard way they could be wasted. "It's Carter now," she said, "if the arrangement stands." Something moved behind his eyes. Not surprise, something more interior than that. A man recalculating. "It stands," he said. "Then we shouldn't waste the morning," she said, and shifted her bag to her other hand. He turned and walked. She followed. She felt the town watching her all the way down First Street, and she felt underneath the watching something sharper, the specific attention of one person among the crowd who was not watching her the way the others were. Not with judgment, not with idle curiosity. With interest. The calculating kind. She didn't turn to find the source because she'd learned early that you didn't let people know you'd clocked them. You just filed the feeling away and kept moving. She kept moving. The blacksmith shop occupied the ground floor of a plain 2-story building on the main street, functional, undecorated, built by someone who considered ornament a waste of material. The sign above the door read, H. Carter, Blacksmith and Ironworks, in letters that had faded from black to dark gray. The forge was already lit. She felt the heat through the wall before he opened the door. He showed her the staircase at the side of the building that led upstairs to the living quarters. He did this the way he seemed to do most things efficiently without preamble. "Kitchen's through there," he said. "Storeroom off the back. I eat at 6. I'm in the forge by 4:30 and I don't come up until the work is done." A pause. "Any questions?" She looked at the space with the rapid, systematic attention she'd developed over a decade of walking into other people's homes and understanding them quickly. 2 chairs. A table that had not been wiped down recently. A stove that worked but hadn't been cleaned in a month. A shelf of dishes that didn't match. A window with good eastern light. "One question," she said. "Go ahead." "Where do you want me to sleep?" The pause was brief. "Room at the end of the hall, door locks from the inside, keys already in it." "Thank you," she said. He nodded once and went back downstairs to his forge. She stood in the kitchen alone for perhaps 10 seconds. Then she found the apron on the hook near the door, stiff with old grease, unused for a long time, tied it on, opened the storeroom and got to work. She had supper started in 40 minutes. She had the surfaces cleared and the kitchen functional in an hour. She found eggs she hadn't been told about, and dried apples tucked behind a tin of cornmeal and a jar of preserved peaches pushed to the very back of the highest shelf, as if someone had stopped expecting good things and stopped looking for them. She put the peaches back. Those she would save. At 6 o'clock exactly, Henry Carter's boots sounded on the stairs. He stopped in the kitchen doorway. She heard the pause in his step, the small involuntary hesitation of a man encountering something other than what he'd braced for. "Sit down," she said without turning from the stove. "It's almost ready." He sat. She served salt pork with fried apples and cornbread from the skillet and set it in front of him and sat across the table and began to eat. He looked at the plate. Then at her. Then he picked up his fork and he ate with the focused efficiency of a man who had been doing physical labor since before dawn and needed fuel more than conversation, and when he was done, he had left nothing on the plate. She filed that away too. "That was good," he said. "It was what there was to work with," she said. "Tomorrow I'll have a better count of the stores." He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment in a different way than before. Not the blankness of a man withholding, but the quiet of a man working something out. "The arrangement," he said. She looked at him. "You said in your letter you never start something you don't finish." "That's correct. I've had 2 women before you." His voice didn't change pitch or pace. He was recounting fact, not soliciting sympathy. "First one left after 3 weeks. Town was too small," she said. "Second one..." He stopped. Something tightened at the corner of his jaw, just briefly. She found someone with more to offer. Evelyn looked at him steadily. In the line of his jaw, where that thing had tightened, she saw it the one crack in the surface. Not grief exactly, something older than grief. Something that had been decided over and settled into, and was now simply part of the structure of him, the way a repaired weld becomes part of the metal. He was not asking for sympathy. He was not capable. She suspected of asking for sympathy. What he was doing, and this was the thing that lodged itself in her chest without warning, was telling her the truth. Plainly, without packaging it, without asking her to feel sorry for him. Just the truth handed over like a fact about the storeroom inventory. She had not met very many people in her life who did that. "I'm not looking for someone with more to offer," she said. "I came here for work. I intend to do it." He looked at her for a long moment. "Then we understand each other," he said. "I believe we do." He finished his coffee at the window looking out at First Street, then set the cup on the counter and said goodnight and went to bed. She washed the dishes, dried them, hung the cloth, and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment before going to her room. The key was in the door. She did not lock it. She lay down on the bed harder than she would have liked, softer than she'd feared, and listened. From below through the floorboards came the sound of iron being struck. Rhythmic, deliberate, relentless. Henry Carter, it appeared, had gone back to his forge. She fell asleep to the sound of it, and it was the first time in 4 months she had fallen asleep without lying awake first. Morning began earlier in Caldwell Falls than anywhere she had ever lived. She was up before the light shifted, dressed with the speed of a woman who didn't require a mirror, and hadn't for years, and in the kitchen before the town's roosters had finished their argument. The forge below was already going. She could feel it through the soles of her boots. She went to the storeroom and took a full inventory. This time methodical, thorough writing. Nothing down because she didn't need to. She cataloged it in the way she cataloged everything once, completely permanently. There was enough to work with. More than enough if you knew what to do with it. She knew what to do with it. She made breakfast. When Henry came up at 7:30, hands scrubbed pink at the basin, she set his plate without ceremony, poured his coffee without asking, and sat across from him with her own. He noticed the eggs. 12 hens out back, she said before he could form the question. They look healthy. I'll track the laying. He ate. Then, there's a garden plot past the coop. I saw it. Nothing in it. Not now, she said. I'm thinking about spring. He looked at her over his coffee cup, the same look as yesterday. The one that wasn't quite surprise, wasn't quite respect, but lived in the territory between them. He didn't say anything. He went back to his forge. She did not expect him to say anything. She didn't need him to. The general store announced itself as trouble before she pushed the door open purely from the way the two women inside stopped talking the instant the bell above the door rang. Evelyn walked in and understood the room completely within the first 4 seconds. The woman behind the counter was Patrice Hollis. Evelyn would not learn her name until later, but she knew the type, a woman who had never had reason to doubt her own assessments and had therefore never developed the muscle of doubt. Trim, well-dressed for this latitude, and already looking at Evelyn the way people look at an error. You're Henry Carter's wife, Patrice said. I am. The pause Patrice left was engineered long enough to carry its meaning. He put an advertisement in the paper, she said. Couldn't find one closer to home. I suppose not. Evelyn looked at her pleasantly. I'll need dried beans, a pound of salt, and a spool of black thread. Good quality if you have it. Patrice blinked. She had prepared for impact and received a shopping list. It threw her more than an argument would have. Behind Evelyn, the two other women exchanged a glance she felt without turning around. She paid exactly what was asked, thanked Patrice with complete sincerity, and walked out. On the boardwalk, she nearly walked into him. He was a large man, heavy through the chest, and middle, well-dressed in the way that announced money rather than taste, and he had been standing just outside the store door in a position that was either coincidental or wasn't. He looked at her with the kind of attention that had an agenda behind it, the kind that assessed rather than simply observed. Ma'am, he said, and touched his hat. The courtesy was technically correct and entirely without warmth. Sir, she said, and kept walking. She learned his name that evening, not from Henry, but from the conversation she overheard through the floorboards while she was mending at the kitchen table. Two men talking below in the shop, voices low but carrying. Gerald Marsh. She caught the name 3 times, and the tone Henry used when he said it, careful, contained the tone of a man who was managing something he didn't trust, told her everything she needed to know about the category of problem Gerald Marsh represented. She kept mending and said nothing. When Henry came upstairs, she served supper, and they ate in their usual silence, and it was only when he was finishing his coffee that he said without preamble, Marsh came by today. I saw him outside the store, she said. Henry looked at her sharply. He speak to you? He said ma'am, and touched his hat. Something hardened in Henry's jaw. If he speaks to you again, what does he want? She asked. A pause. Henry set down his cup. My building wants to expand his holdings on this block. I've told him it's not for sale. He said it flatly, the way he said everything. But underneath the flatness, there was something else, the particular tension of a man who has been told a thing repeatedly by someone who hasn't accepted the answer. Has he accepted that? She asked. Henry looked at her. No, he said. They held each other's gaze for a moment. Then she stacked the plates and carried them to the basin, and he sat at the table a few minutes longer than usual. And she understood that the silence, the shared meal, the information passed without drama, was already becoming something. She couldn't have named it precisely, but she felt its weight. Quiet and specific, like the difference between a building with no one in it and a building with a fire going. She found his split-seamed work shirt the next morning. She sat at the kitchen table before he was up and sewed it closed with stitches that would outlast the shirt itself, and she hung it back on its hook and started the coffee and said nothing about it. He saw it. She watched him see it, the hand that went to the shoulder seam without thinking, the fingers that found the mend and stopped. He didn't say a word. But 2 hours later, he came upstairs outside his usual schedule and set a small coil of black thread on the kitchen table, heavier weight than what she'd bought at Patrice Hollis's store, the kind that would last twice as long under hard use. He set it down and went to wash his hands without explanation or ceremony. Evelyn looked at the thread. She picked it up and put it in her sewing kit. Outside, the October sky had gone the color of pewter, and the first real cold of the season was moving in off the plains with the particular seriousness of weather that means what it says. Inside, the stove was going, and the coffee was hot, and two people who had come together out of pure necessity were slowly, without naming it, without rushing it, beginning to learn the shape of each other. In the land office 2 blocks away, Gerald Marsh was signing papers he had prepared 3 weeks ago, before Evelyn had ever stepped off a train, in anticipation of a vacancy that had not yet occurred, but that he had decided was only a matter of patience. He had not counted on the Swedish woman. He was already reconsidering what that meant for his plans. And somewhere in that reconsideration, without his quite intending it, Evelyn Carter had become not just an inconvenience, but an obstacle, and Gerald Marsh had a very specific way of handling obstacles. She didn't know that yet. She was at the kitchen table with her sewing kit, mending a small tear in her second dress by the light of the window, listening to the forge below, feeling the warmth of the stove at her back. It was not love, not yet, not even a shadow of it, but it was the first place in 4 years that had felt in some quiet and provisional and entirely unromantic way like it might be worth staying in. For a woman who had spent her whole life arriving and leaving and arriving again, that was not nothing. That was, if she allowed herself to think it clearly, which she did just once, sitting at that table in the October light, everything. The cold came into Caldwell Falls, the way trouble always came quietly, and then all at once. Evelyn felt it the morning she walked out to the hen coop and found the water in the trough had skinned over with ice for the first time. She broke it with her knuckle, watched the hens drink, and stood there for a moment looking at the garden plot she had been preparing in whatever spare time she could carve out of the days. The soil was turned, the beds were shaped. Everything was ready for a spring that was still 6 months away, and she had put that work in anyway, because that was the only way she knew how to do anything, as if the future was certain even when it wasn't. She went back inside and made breakfast and said nothing about the ice. Henry noticed she'd been out to the coop earlier than usual. She could tell by the way he looked at her when he came up from the forge, the quick assessing glance that she was starting to recognize as his version of paying attention. He didn't ask. She didn't explain. They ate in the comfortable silence that had replaced the uncomfortable one, and she refilled his coffee without being asked, and he passed her the bread before she reached for it, and neither of them remarked on any of it. That was the thing about Henry Carter that Evelyn had not expected and could not quite account for. He was not warm. He was not demonstrative. He did not say things unless he had decided they needed to be said. But he watched. He paid attention with a consistency and a quietness that she found the longer she was around it more unnerving than indifference would have been. Indifference she knew how to manage. This, whatever this was, she was still working out. She was clearing the breakfast things when he said without preamble, "Marsh was at the land office again yesterday." She set down the plate she was holding. "How do you know?" "Tom Wheeler told me. Works the feed store across the street. Sees everything that goes in and out of that building." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. "Marsh filed some kind of inquiry. Tom didn't know the specifics." "An inquiry about what?" "My deed," Henry said. or something adjacent to it. Evelyn turned fully to face him. Can he do that? A man with Marsh's money can do a lot of things, Henry said. Whether he can do this particular thing I don't know yet. I need to talk to someone who understands land law better than I do. Is there someone like that in Caldwell Falls? There's a lawyer, Harlan Greer, office on 2nd Street. He paused. He does most of his work for Marsh. The silence that followed was not comfortable. It was the silence of two people registering the shape of a problem that is larger than it first appeared. Then he's not the right person to talk to, Evelyn said. No. The next town. Millhaven, 20 miles east. There's a man there, Cyrus Aldred. He's good. He's honest. I used him when I first bought this property. Henry set down the cup. I'd need a full day away from the forge. Then go, she said. He looked at her. Go, she said again simply. I'll manage the shop. You don't know anything about... I know how to talk to people, she said. And I know how to say, you'll be back tomorrow, and take a message. That's all a closed forge needs for one day. Something moved across his face, not quite relief, not quite resistance. The expression of a man who had been managing alone for so long that the offer of help required a moment to be processed before it could be accepted. All right, he said. Day after tomorrow if the weather holds. Good. She picked up the plate again and turned back to the basin. Behind her she heard the scrape of his chair, his boots on the floorboards, then his voice quieter than usual just before he reached the stairs. Evelyn? She looked over her shoulder. He didn't quite look at her when he said it. He looked somewhere adjacent to her in the manner of a man delivering something that costs him something. I appreciate it, he said. She held his gaze, or the near gaze, the honest near miss of it. I know, she said. He went downstairs. She stood at the basin for a moment with the plate in her hands, and something small and specific moved through her chest that she did not examine too closely, because she had learned a long time ago that the things you examine too closely in the early stages have a way of becoming fragile. She washed the plate and moved on. The inquiry she could not yet ignore arrived 2 days later, not from Marsh directly, but from the direction no one expects trouble to come from the church. She had attended the previous Sunday because it seemed the right thing to do in a town where being visible in the correct places mattered to the question of being accepted. And she had sat in the pew beside Henry with the straight-backed composure she brought to all public situations. And she had felt the particular quality of attention that a congregation directs toward a new member. It hasn't decided about yet, and she had managed it without incident. What she had not anticipated was Pastor Reeves' wife. Clara Reeve was a small, careful woman with the kind of sweetness that had very fine teeth if you pressed against it wrong. She arrived at the blacksmith shop mid-morning with a basket of preserves and a smile that was extended 3 inches past genuine, and Evelyn brought her upstairs and made tea, because that was what you did, and sat across from her with the patience of a woman who knew an agenda was coming and was waiting for it to arrive. It arrived over the second cup. We're all just so glad Henry has someone, Clara said, setting down the cup with a precision that was not accidental. He's been alone a long time, a man like that well. He needs managing. Does he? Evelyn said. I only mean... Clara arranged her hands in her lap. The town was worried about him. After what happened with Margaret. A pause waited with implication. You do know about Margaret. Evelyn looked at her steadily. She did not know about Margaret. Henry had told her about 2 women, one who left because the town was too small, one who found someone with more to offer. He had not used a name. He had not given her one. And now here was a name delivered in a basket with the preserves wrapped in concern that was actually something else. Henry and I have spoken about his past, Evelyn said, which was true enough to stand on. Clara's smile recalibrated slightly. Of course. Just a woman in your position arriving the way you did, I imagine it's not easy not knowing people. I'm getting to know them, Evelyn said. Gerald Marsh was asking about you, Clara said, dropping it in between one breath and the next, the way you drop something to see how it lands. Just generally. curious about the new arrival. "That's kind of him," Evelyn said, and her face gave nothing. Clara left 20 minutes later with her basket and her smile, and the distinct, slightly unsatisfied expression of a woman who had come to take stock of something and found the inventory better secured than expected. Evelyn stood at the window and watched her go, and then sat down at the kitchen table and thought very carefully about the name Margaret, and what it meant that Henry hadn't used it, and what it meant that Gerald Marsh was asking questions about her through the pastor's wife, and what it meant that all of this was converging in the same week that Marsh had filed an inquiry at the land office. She was still thinking when she heard the boots on the stairs. Not Henry's cadence, which she had learned already, the way you learn the particular sound of a house you live in. These were heavier, slower, with the deliberate tread of someone who expects the space to accommodate them. She was on her feet before the knock came. She opened the door. Gerald Marsh stood in the stairwell with his hat in his hands and a smile that had been practiced until it looked almost natural. "Mrs. Carter," he said. "Hope I'm not disturbing." "Mr. Marsh," she said. She did not move from the doorway. "My husband isn't here." "I know it," he said pleasantly. "It's you I came to speak with." The pause she gave him was exactly long enough to make the point without being long enough to be called rude. Then she stepped back, because refusing him entry would make a story that would travel faster than anything she wanted traveling, and she was not in a position yet to spend that kind of currency. "Tea," she said. It was not a question. "Much obliged," he said, and followed her in. She put the kettle on and stayed on her feet, her back to him for as little time as possible, and he sat at the table. Henry's chair, she noticed, which was perhaps accidental and perhaps was not, and looked around the kitchen with the particular attention of a man appraising property. "You've done a lot with this place," he said. "Henry never was much for housekeeping." "Men who work 12-hour days often aren't," she said. He smiled at that. "You're direct," he said. "I appreciate that in a person." She set the tea in front of him and sat in her own chair across the table, which put Henry's chair and Marsh in it between her and the door. She noted this and filed it and kept her face open and pleasant. "Mrs. Carter," Marsh said, wrapping his hands around the cup. "I'm going to be direct with you in return since we've established that's the mode we're working in." He looked at her with the full attention of a man who had decided he was doing her a favor. "I have a significant interest in this block. Have had for some time. The smithy is the last piece I don't control, and frankly, Henry's work is good, but this building is worth considerably more to me as part of a larger development than it is as a blacksmith shop." "I see," Evelyn said. "Henry's a stubborn man," Marsh said with a kind of affectionate condescension that made her jaw tighten. "Always has been. I respect that. But I think you're a practical woman, and I think you understand that stubbornness has a cost." He reached into his vest pocket and placed a folded paper on the table between them. "That's a figure, a generous one, more than fair market." Evelyn looked at the paper without touching it. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "this building belongs to my husband." "It does," he agreed. "But a wife has influence. That's all I'm suggesting." "You're suggesting I persuade my husband to sell his livelihood. I'm suggesting you persuade him to consider a very comfortable future somewhere other than Caldwell Falls." The smile again, the practiced one. "With that kind of money, a man could set up anywhere. A woman of your circumstances might find it appealing to start fresh somewhere larger. More opportunity. More, a pause that lasted exactly one beat too long, acceptance." The word landed where he'd aimed it. She felt it. And she sat with it for precisely as long as it took her to understand what he'd done and decide what to do about it, which was the work of about 4 seconds. She picked up the paper. She unfolded it. She read the number. She folded it again and placed it back on the table and pushed it across to him with 2 fingers, slowly, until it was back in front of him where it had started. "Mr. Marsh," she said, "I appreciate you coming by." His smile didn't move, but something behind it did. "Mrs. Carter." "My husband's answer is no," she said. "My answer is no. I don't expect either of those will change." She looked at him with the complete unperformed calm that had unnerved Patrice Hollis and was doing something similar to Gerald Marsh, though he was better at not showing it. "Finish your tea, it's cold today." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he drank the tea. He stood, collected the paper, replaced his hat, and looked at her one final time from the doorway with an expression that had shed the pretense of goodwill, and was now simply the face of a man noting where the obstacle is. "Good day, Mrs. Carter," he said. "Good day," she said. She listened to his boots go down the stairs. She heard the street door open and close. She sat at the table without moving for a full minute because she needed the minute, and then she got up and washed his cup and put it back on the shelf. She told Henry that evening over supper precisely and completely, leaving nothing out. He went very still in the way that was she now understood Henry Carter's version of a strong reaction. The stillness lasted through her account, and for a moment after it, and then he said very quietly, "He came here, to this house." "Yes." "He sat at this table." "He did." The muscle in his jaw tightened and released. "What did he say when you—" "He left," she said. "Took his paper with him." Henry looked at her across the table. Whatever he was feeling was working close to the surface in a way she hadn't seen before. Not quite anger, not quite something else, but something that occupied the space between them differently than silence usually did. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "You should have sent for me." His voice was careful in the way of a man calibrating. "You were in Millhaven," she said. "You should have. What would you have done differently?" she asked. Not with challenge, with genuine inquiry. He stopped. He thought about that with the same honesty he brought to everything. Then, nothing probably. "Then we're fine," she said, and picked up her fork. He watched her for a moment longer than usual. Then he picked up his own fork. "He'll come back," he said. "I know it. And it won't be tea next time." "No," she said. "I don't expect it will be." They finished supper. She cleared the plates. He sat at the table, and she could feel him thinking. "The way you feel, weather coming, a change in the quality of the air." And when she came back from the basin, he said without looking up, "Margaret was—" He stopped. She sat down across from him and did not fill the silence, because she understood by now that his silences needed room. "She left with Marsh," he said. Flat, simple. A fact delivered the way he delivered all facts, with the same voice he'd used to tell her the price of iron. 2 years ago, she decided she told me the shop wasn't enough, that I wasn't enough. Marsh had land and money, and—" He stopped again. "She left on a Tuesday, didn't say goodbye." Evelyn looked at him. At the line of his jaw and the particular quality of blankness that she now recognized was not the absence of feeling, but the practiced containment of it, the expression of a man who had felt something devastating and built a wall around it, and then kept building long after the initial necessity had passed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm not telling you for sympathy," he said immediately. "I know," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He looked at her then, really looked in a way that was different from the careful, assessing attention she'd grown used to, something more unguarded, something that had lowered a register. "Marsh knows what he did," Henry said. "And he knows I know. And now he's—" He looked at the table. "I should have warned you, what you were walking into when you came here. I should have told you about Margaret before, Henry." She said his name quietly, and he stopped talking. "I didn't come here needing a clean history. I came here needing work and a door with a key." She looked at him directly. "I've got both." Something shifted in his face, very small, very specific, like a seam that had been under pressure for a long time, releasing by exactly 1 degree. "Yeah," he said after a moment. "You do." He went back to the forge an hour later, and she sat at the kitchen table with her mending and the lamp and the sound of iron from below. And she thought about a woman named Margaret who had left on a Tuesday without saying goodbye, and she thought about Gerald Marsh, and what it meant that he had connected those two things, Henry's history and her own uncertain position, and made of them a lever. She thought about it until she understood it fully. Then she set down the mending and took out the small piece of paper she kept in her sewing kit. Not the paper Marsh had brought that was gone with him, but her own paper, and wrote down everything she had observed since arriving in Caldwell Falls in the precise and detailed manner of a woman organizing a problem she intends to solve. She wrote for an hour. Then she folded the paper and put it back in the kit and went to bed, and this time she lay awake for a while before sleeping, because there was a shape forming at the edges of what she knew a shape that had Gerald Marsh at its center and Henry's deed somewhere in its machinery, and she didn't have enough of the pieces yet to see it whole. What she had was enough to know it was coming. 3 days later, it announced itself. She was in the storeroom taking the morning inventory when she heard voices downstairs, not through the floorboards this time, but through the thin wall that separated the storeroom from the rear of the shop where Henry sometimes met with customers. She wasn't trying to listen. She was simply there, and the wall was thin, and the voice that wasn't Henry's was not making any effort toward discretion. Can't keep operating on a deed that's got questions against it, Henry. I'm telling you there are no questions against my deed, Henry said. She recognized the particular controlled flatness in his voice that meant he was keeping the lid on something. Marsh filed a competing claim. The other voice said, older. She thought someone who'd known Henry a while. Says the original survey was faulty. Says the eastern boundary line puts 2 feet of your foundation on land that was his father's. A silence. That's not true, Henry said. I know it's not. But he's got a surveyor will say it is, and that's what matters in a courthouse, Henry. That's what matters. Another silence. Longer. How long do I have? Henry said. 60 days the way he's filed it. You need Aldred. You need him now. I saw Aldred, Henry said. Last week. He's pulling the original survey records from the county office. Good. Good, that's... The other voice dropped lower, and she caught the next words in pieces, rather than whole. Marsh is connected judge in the county seat. Greer is already. She stopped trying to hear and stood in the storeroom with her inventory list and understood what she was holding. Not just a territorial dispute, a designed one. A mechanism that had been built and set in motion before she had ever stepped off the train, aimed at a man who had already lost one woman to Gerald Marsh, and was now being maneuvered toward losing the only solid thing he had left. She walked back into the kitchen and put the kettle on. When Henry came upstairs 20 minutes later, his face had the controlled, contained quality of a man managing bad news, and she set his coffee in front of him and sat down and said, I heard. The wall in the storeroom isn't thick. He looked at her. Tell me everything Aldred said, she said. All of it. He told her. It took a while. She listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she asked 3 specific questions about the original survey date, about the land office records, about whether the competing surveyor Marsh was using had worked for Marsh before, and the way she asked them made him go still in the way she was coming to associate with him recalibrating. How do you know to ask those things? He said. My father had a land dispute in Sweden, she said. We lost. I was 12. I learned what the questions should have been too late to be useful then. She looked at him. It won't happen that way this time. He looked at her for a long time. Evelyn, he said. Henry, she said. Why are you... He stopped. Tried again. This isn't... You didn't sign on for this. I signed on for work, she said. This is work. This is a legal fight with a man who has a judge and a lawyer and unlimited patience. Yes, she said. And you have Aldred a clean original deed and me. She looked at him steadily across the table. Don't discount me. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Not the near gaze, not the careful blankness, not the controlled containment. Something more open than any of those, something that had the quality of a man briefly and voluntarily allowing himself to be seen. He looked down at the table. All right, he said quietly. All right, she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the October sky had gone entirely gray, and the wind off the plains had found the gap under the kitchen door and was making its presence known. and the forge below was adding its warmth through the floor in the way that had become, without her quite deciding it, one of the reliable anchors of her days in this place. She was still afraid. Not of Marsh exactly, and not of the legal mechanism he had built. She was afraid of the shape of what she was becoming in this house, in this town, at this table. The way she was threading herself into the structure of Henry Carter's life, with every mended seam and every question she knew how to ask, and every morning she woke up and got to work before he came upstairs. She was afraid because she had not intended this, and the things you don't intend have a way of mattering most. She did not examine that fear closely. Not yet. She put it in the same place she put the preserved peaches on the high shelf, saved for later, for when the circumstances warranted it. For now there was work. For now there was a legal fight to understand, and a man named Marsh to outmaneuver, and a forge below her feet that was still going at 9 o'clock at night, because Henry Carter had never learned how to stop working, and probably never would. And she found sitting at the kitchen table in the lamplight with her coffee going cold that she did not mind that about him. She did not mind it at all. That was the thing that frightened her most of all. Not Marsh, not the deed, not the 60 days or the county judge or the surveyor for hire. The thing that frightened her sitting in that kitchen, in that house, at that table, was how completely she had stopped wanting to be anywhere else. The letter from the county courthouse arrived on a Wednesday morning, and Henry brought it upstairs without opening it. He set it on the table in front of her and stood back, and she understood from the way he stood the particular stillness of a man who has been bracing for something and is now waiting to find out if his brace was sufficient, that he already knew what it contained and needed a moment before he knew it officially. She picked it up. She opened it. She read it twice. 45 days, she said. They moved the timeline up. Henry said nothing. Marsh filed a supplemental claim, she said, reading. He found a second surveyor, affidavit signed last week. She set the letter on the table and looked at Henry directly. He's accelerating. Because he knows Aldred is pulling the original records, Henry said. His voice had the flat, contained quality she recognized now as controlled anger rather than indifference. He wants the hearing before Aldred has time to build a full case. Then Aldred needs to move faster, she said. Aldred is one man with a 2-room office and 3 other cases. Does he have what he needs from you? Everything I could give him. Then what's missing? Henry pulled out the chair across from her and sat down heavily. Not the way he usually sat, which was deliberate and economical, but the way a man sits when something has been wearing on him longer than he's shown. The original survey was done by a man named Caleb Pruitt, 31 years ago. Pruitt's been dead 12 years. His records went to his son in Abilene. Aldred wrote to the son 2 weeks ago. No answer. Evelyn looked at the letter on the table, then at Henry. What's the son's name? Daniel Pruitt. And Aldred has the address in Abilene. He does. Then someone should go to Abilene, she said. Henry looked at her. It's 4 days by stage. I know how far Abilene is, she said. I can't leave the forge for 8 days, Evelyn. We're already running short on— I didn't say you, she said. The silence that followed was the specific kind that happens when a man hears something he wasn't prepared to hear, and his mind is catching up to it. No, he said. Henry? Absolutely not, he said, and his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard before. Not the controlled flatness, not the careful measurement, but something more immediate, something that had heat in it. You're not traveling 4 days alone to a city you've never been to find a man who may not even— I traveled alone from Stockholm to Chicago at 19, she said, with $40 and no English. I believe I can manage Abilene. That was different. How was it different? He looked at her and then away, and then back, and she could see him working through the argument and finding each time that it didn't hold the way he needed it to. It was different, he said again, but with less certainty. It was not different, she said not unkindly, and you know it. She picked up the letter and set it aside. Someone needs to go to Abilene and put Aldred's letter in Daniel Pruitt's hands personally, and wait for an answer. I can do that. I am the right person to do that. And you need to stay here and keep the forge going, because without the forge, there is no house to fight for." Henry was quiet for the long time. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it working at the eaves, and from below came the distant rhythmic sound of metal that had become the reliable bass note of her days here. "It's not safe," he said. Finally, quietly. "Most things worth doing aren't," she said. He looked at her with the full, unguarded attention that still surprised her when it came the look that had no performance in it, that was simply a man seeing a woman clearly and not knowing entirely what to do with what he saw. "I don't like it," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm going anyway." He didn't argue. That she was learning was its own kind of language with Henry Carter. The argument he didn't make was often the loudest thing he said. She began preparing that afternoon. She did not pack lightly, because she never packed lightly. She packed specifically, which looked like the same thing, but was entirely different. She left the kitchen organized in the way that would make it manageable for a man who had no real practice managing it. She wrote out the inventory of the storeroom on a slip of paper and left it on the shelf. She filled the wood box to the top. She moved the hen feeding to a schedule Henry could maintain without thinking about it, and she explained it to him the evening before she left in the brief, practical way he preferred, and he listened without interrupting, which was his version of paying close attention. The night before she left, she was at the kitchen table finishing the last of her preparations when he came upstairs from the forge later than usual, nearly 10 o'clock, and stood in the kitchen doorway in that way of his, taking in the organized space, the packed bag by the door, the paper on the shelf. "It'll be cold on the stage," he said. "I have my coat." He disappeared back downstairs. She thought he was done. 40 minutes later, she heard the stairs again, and he came in and set something on the table beside her. A wool blanket, dark gray, tightly woven. Not old. She had never seen it in the house. "Henry," she said. "It gets cold on the stage," he said, and his voice had the careful neutrality of a man delivering something he doesn't want examined. He was already turning back toward the stairs. "Henry." He stopped. "Thank you," she said. He didn't turn around. "Get the records," he said. "Come back safe." And then he went downstairs, and she heard the forge door and the sound of iron. And she sat at the table with the gray blanket in her lap, and felt with a clarity that was neither comfortable nor avoidable, that something had shifted between them so incrementally and so completely that she could no longer locate the point where it had begun. She left on the 6 o'clock stage the next morning. Henry was at the forge already. He did not come out to see her off, and she did not expect him to. But when she passed the shop door, it was open, propped with the iron wedge he used when he was working with the big pieces that needed room, and she could see him at the anvil, his back to her, hammer in hand. He knew she was there. She knew he knew. She kept walking. The stage to Abilene was 4 days of cold and dust, and the company of 3 other passengers, a dry goods salesman from Missouri, a young woman traveling to meet her husband, and an older man who slept for most of the journey and snored with impressive dedication. Evelyn sat with the gray blanket across her lap and watched the country move past, and thought about what she was going to say to Daniel Pruitt, and thought about Henry at the forge, and thought about Gerald Marsh filing papers with accelerating confidence. And somewhere in the second day's travel, she thought about the word home, how it had always been an abstract for her, a destination perpetually ahead rather than a place she occupied, and how it was becoming, without her permission, a word with a specific address attached to it. She arrived in Abilene on the afternoon of the 4th day, found a clean, inexpensive room at a boarding house 3 blocks from the stage depot, and went directly to the address Aldred had given her. Daniel Pruitt was not what she expected. He was younger than she'd imagined, mid-30s, with his father's surveying equipment stacked in the corner of a modest office above a grain supplier, and the particular expression of a man who receives unexpected visitors and is not sure whether to be pleased or alarmed. "Mrs. Carter," he said, reading Aldred's letter after she handed it to him. He read it twice. He set it on the desk. "You came from Caldwell Falls yourself." "I did." That's 4 days." "I'm aware," she said. He looked at her with the frank assessment of someone recalibrating their assumptions. My father surveyed that property in 1861, he said. I have the records. I kept everything. My father was meticulous. He paused. I didn't answer Mr. Aldred's letter because I wasn't sure what answering it would mean. A man named Marsh sent me a letter 3 weeks ago. Evelyn went still. What kind of letter? Pruitt opened his desk drawer and produced it. He held it out to her, and she took it and read it, and it was not technically a threat. Marsh was too careful for that, but it was the kind of letter that made a threat unnecessary. It offered Pruitt money for his father's survey records, a significant amount, and it suggested in language that was almost gentle that records which contradicted a filed claim could make things complicated for the record keeper. She set the letter on the desk beside Aldred's. Mr. Pruitt, she said, my husband is an honest man. He bought that property legally 31 years ago using your father's survey. Gerald Marsh is trying to take it from him using a fraudulent competing claim, and he is doing it in a courthouse where he has influence, and we do not. Your father's original records are the only thing that will stop him. She looked at Pruitt directly. Marsh offered you money to hand over those records or stay quiet. I can't match what he offered. What I can tell you is that your father did honest work. And the question in front of you right now is whether his work stands or whether it gets buried by a man who buys whatever he can't take. Pruitt was quiet for a long time. He looked at Marsh's letter. He looked at Aldred's letter. He looked at Evelyn. My father was the most honest man I ever knew, he said. I thought he might be, she said, given what he left behind. Another silence. Then Pruitt opened the bottom drawer of his desk and took out a flat leather case, old well-kept, the initials CP stamped in the corner, and set it on the desk between them. I'll come to Caldwell Falls myself, he said. I'll bring the original field notes and the measurement records, and I'll testify if it comes to testimony. He looked at her with something in his expression she recognized, the specific look of a person who has made a decision that costs them something and has made it anyway. Marsh's money isn't worth my father's name. Evelyn put both hands flat on the desk and took one slow breath. Thank you, she said. Genuinely. She sent a telegram to Aldred that evening and was back on the stage the next morning. The return trip was faster in the way. Return trips always are not in actual time, but in the quality of it. The difference between traveling toward an unknown and traveling toward something that was waiting for you. She sat with the gray blanket and watched the country in reverse and did not let herself think too far ahead, because she had learned that counting things before they were settled was a way of giving them room to go wrong. She was back in Caldwell Falls on a Thursday evening 6 days after she'd left. The forge was still going. She could hear it from the street. She pushed open the shop door, and the heat of it hit her immediately, and Henry was at the anvil with his back to the door, and he didn't stop working when he heard her come in, because he was mid-strike on a piece that needed the heat. He finished the sequence, set the hammer down, turned around. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had never seen on him before, or rather had seen in fragments, and never assembled into the whole of it until now. It was relief. Simple, undisguised, and apparently uncontrollable, because he hadn't managed to put the blankness back in place before she saw it. You're back, he said. I said I would be, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at the bag in her hand. Did you? Pruitt is coming himself, she said. He has the original field notes and measurement records. He'll testify. Henry went very still. He turned down Marsh's money, she said. Marsh had gotten to him first, offered him a significant sum for the records or his silence. Pruitt said no. Henry's jaw worked once. Marsh got to Pruitt. He did? It didn't work. She met his eyes. Aldred knows. He's filing a response to the accelerated hearing request and asking for a 30-day extension based on new material witness. He thinks the judge will grant it, given what Pruitt brings. Henry turned back to the forge. He stood with his hands on the edge of the work table, his back to her, and she could see the line of his shoulders and the quality of the tension in them, and how it was slowly over the course of about 15 seconds changing. Henry, she said. Give me a minute, he said. His voice was rough, in a way it hadn't been before. She gave him the minute. When he turned back around, he had the blankness mostly reconstructed, but not completely. There were gaps in it, places where what was underneath was still visible. And she looked at those places and said nothing, because some things didn't need to be named to be understood. "You hungry?" he said. "Extremely," she said. "There's stew," he said. "I made it yesterday. It's probably—" "Henry," she said. "You made stew." He looked slightly defensive. "It's edible." "I'm sure it is," she said, and she was smiling, and she didn't try to manage it, and something moved across his face in response to that quick, involuntary, and more open than anything she'd seen from him. They went upstairs. The stew was in fact edible. It was not good. It was the stew of a man who understood that food needed to be made but had no intuitive feeling for the making of it. But she ate 2 bowls, and he watched her eat with an expression she had learned to read by now. The satisfaction of someone whose effort has been received, and she thought about how many people in his life had received his efforts, and how many had simply expected them. And she thought that was probably a long, sad answer that she didn't yet have all the pieces of. After supper, he said, "Clara Reeve came by while you were gone." Evelyn set down her cup. "What did she want?" "She wanted to know when you'd be back." He paused. "She also said, and I'm giving this to you without the wrapping it came in, that Marsh has been telling people in town that you left because the arrangement wasn't what you expected." The silence that followed was very quiet and very deliberate. "He's been saying I left," she said. "That you'd gone back to Chicago," Henry said. His voice was level, but she could hear the effort it was costing him. That the marriage was, that it had been a mistake on both sides. Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The architecture of it was actually elegant in the way that malicious things sometimes are. If people believed she had left, it changed the story of Henry Carter in this town. It reinforced everything Marsh wanted reinforced. It made Henry look like a man who couldn't hold a marriage, couldn't hold property, couldn't hold anything, and it made Marsh's offer look, by comparison, like mercy. "How many people heard it?" she said. "Enough," Henry said. "And what did you say?" "I said my wife was in Abilene on business." He looked at her directly. Patrice Hollis nearly fell over. Evelyn felt something she recognized after a moment as the specific satisfaction of a narrative being corrected. "Good," she said. "There's something else," Henry said. He said it in the tone of a man who has been deciding whether to tell something and has arrived reluctantly at yes. She waited. "When you were gone," he said, "Marsh came by the shop. In person this time. Not with tea and paperwork with 2 men I didn't recognize." He paused. "He told me that the legal situation was going to resolve in his favor, regardless of what Aldred filed, because the judge hearing the case is a man named Elias Croft, who has been in Marsh's pocket since 1887. He told me, and I want you to understand, he said this to my face in my shop, that the only question was whether I wanted to make this hard or easy for myself." The air in the kitchen changed. "He threatened you," she said. "He offered me a choice." Henry said with the controlled precision of a man keeping his anger in a specific shape. His words, "He offered me a choice. I could accept his original figure sign over the property and leave Caldwell Falls, or I could fight the hearing, lose the hearing because the judge was already decided, and lose the property anyway, with nothing in my pocket and a legal bill I couldn't pay." "And you said," "I told him to get out of my shop." "Good," she said immediately. "He smiled when he left," Henry said. "That's what I keep thinking about." He smiled. "Because he wasn't afraid of you," Evelyn thought. "Because he has the judge, and he knows it, and he came to tell you so." But she didn't say that, not all of it, not yet, because there was something else she was working out. Something that had been assembling itself in pieces since the moment she'd read Marsh's letter in Daniel Pruitt's office. "Henry," she said, "a judge who rules for Marsh on a fraudulent claim against documented original survey records and a material witness that's not just corruption. That's a public record. That's something that can be appealed to a higher court. That's something a newspaper can print." Henry looked at her. "Does Caldwell Falls have a newspaper?" she said. "The Gazette," he said slowly. Ed Harmon runs it. He paused. He's not in Marsh's pocket, I don't think. Marsh tried to buy ad space and Harmon printed an editorial the next week about the importance of editorial independence. Then Ed Harmon is someone we should talk to, she said. Henry was quiet. Then, you want to go to the newspaper? Not yet, she said. First we let Aldred build the case with Pruitt's records. First we go through the proper channels because it matters that we tried. But if Marsh's judge is going to rule against documented evidence... She looked at Henry steadily. I want Ed Harmon already knowing the full story before that ruling comes down. I want it ready. Henry looked at her for a long time. In the lamplight, with the supper things between them and the forge going below, and the wind at the window, he had the expression of a man who has been fighting something alone for so long that the presence of someone fighting alongside him has not yet fully become real. When did you become, he started and then stopped. What, she said. He shook his head slightly. Nothing. Say it, she said. He looked at her with the open, unmanaged expression she was learning to wait for and never quite getting used to. When did you become the most necessary person in my life, he said, is what I was going to say. He said it the way he said everything, simply without ornament, as a statement of observed fact. I don't know when that happened. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at him across the table, at the iron dust on his forearms and the gray at his temples, and the face that had been closed for so long that these moments of openness still looked like something. It cost him, still looked like a door that didn't open easily and might not stay open long. It happened while you weren't looking, she said quietly. Same as everything else worth anything. He held her gaze. A long moment. Then he looked down at the table. I should get back to the forge, he said. You should sleep, she said. I've got a gate hinge that needs Henry. She said his name with the particular weight she'd developed for it, not sharp, not gentle, something between the two. The forge will be there in the morning. He looked up at her. Sleep, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he pushed back from the table and stood and collected his cup and brought it to the basin without being asked, which was new, which she noticed, and then he stopped by the doorway to the hall and looked back at her. Evelyn, he said. She looked at him. I'm glad you came back, he said. I told you I would, she said. I know, he said. I'm still glad. He went to bed. She sat at the kitchen table alone for a while with the lamp and the quiet and the sound of the wind off the plains. And she thought about what he'd said, the most necessary person in my life. And she thought about how she had come to this town with a bag and a letter and $2.14, and the specific kind of resolve that comes from having nothing left to protect, and how she was now sitting in a kitchen that she had organized, and a house that she had threaded herself into, and fighting for a piece of land that wasn't in her name with a ferocity that surprised her every time she felt it. Not because it was her property, because it was his. And somewhere between the 12 words in the newspaper advertisement and the gray wool blanket set on her table without ceremony, it had become true that what was his was in some way she couldn't precisely articulate and didn't need to, hers too. She blew out the lamp and went to bed. She did not lock the door. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew lying in their separate rooms in the dark house above the cold forge, was that Gerald Marsh had already made his next move. That same evening in the land office on 2nd Street, a document had been filed by Harlan Greer on Marsh's behalf. Not a survey dispute, not a boundary claim. Something different. Something that Aldred would not see until the morning, and that when he saw it, would drain the color from his face and send him riding to the blacksmith shop at 7 in the morning with his hat still in his hands and the particular expression of a man delivering news that changes everything. A challenge to the original deed of purchase, not the boundary, the deed itself. On the grounds that the original transaction 31 years ago had involved a third party who had never been paid a silent partner in the property, Marsh was now claiming, whose share had never been settled, and whose interest in the land had passed upon his death to Gerald Marsh himself through inheritance, A claim so specific, so deeply planted in history, and so difficult to disprove quickly that even Daniel Pruitt's records would not be enough to answer it before the hearing. Henry would need something else. And Evelyn, sitting up in her bed at 7:15 the next morning, listening to Aldred's voice through the kitchen floor, explaining it to Henry, felt the shape of what was coming with the particular clarity of a woman who has spent her whole life reading rooms and understood with a cold and absolute certainty that this was not going to be won in a courthouse. This was going to be won in the truth. And the truth was somewhere in the past. In 31 years of history, she didn't have yet. And she was going to have to find it before 45 days became 44, and 44 became 43. And Gerald Marsh's smile got any wider. She got up, she got dressed, she went to the kitchen and put the kettle on. By the time Henry and Aldred came upstairs, the coffee was ready. Cyrus Aldred was not a man who frightened easily. Evelyn had understood that from the first time Henry had described him, a lawyer who had built his practice on honest work in a region where honest work was frequently the harder choice. But the man who sat across the kitchen table that Thursday morning held his coffee cup with both hands and did not drink from it. And that told her more about the severity of what he'd brought than anything his words had conveyed. The silent partner claim, Aldred said, spreading the filed document on the table between them, is a Thomas Hargrove, deceased 1879. Marsh is claiming Hargrove held a 25% interest in the original land purchase, your father's purchase. Henry, and that interest was never bought out, never legally extinguished, and passed upon Hargrove's death to his only surviving heir. He paused. Gerald Marsh's mother was Hargrove's sister, making Marsh the collateral heir. Henry sat across from Aldred with his hands flat on the table. There was no silent partner, he said. My father bought that land alone. I watched him sign the deed. I was 11 years old and I remember it. I believe you, Aldred said, completely. But belief doesn't win hearings, Henry. Documents do. And right now, Marsh has a document, a ledger entry from a bank in Wichita, dated 1861, showing a deposit made by Thomas Hargrove 1 week before your father's purchase closed. The amount is exactly 25% of the recorded sale price. The kitchen was very quiet. That could be coincidence, Evelyn said. It could be, Aldred said. And Harlan Greer will spend an hour in front of Judge Croft explaining why it isn't. He looked at her directly. A bank deposit matching 25% of a land purchase made 1 week prior by a man connected to the buyer in a courtroom where the judge already knows the outcome he's being paid to deliver, that's not a coincidence. That's a narrative. And Croft will accept it. Henry stood up from the table. He walked to the window. He stood with his back to them, and Evelyn watched the line of his shoulders and said nothing, because she had learned that Henry Carter needed 30 seconds when the ground shifted under him, 30 seconds to find his footing, and then he was back. He turned around in exactly 30 seconds. What do we need? He said. Proof that Hargrove's deposit was unrelated to your father's purchase, Aldred said. A letter, a receipt, a record of what that money actually was, anything that gives it another explanation. Or, he hesitated, proof that Marsh fabricated the claim, that the ledger entry was altered or the connection manufactured. How do we prove a bank ledger was altered? Evelyn asked. We'd need access to the original, Aldred said, which means the bank in Wichita, which means someone going to Wichita, Henry said. Yes. Henry looked at Evelyn. She looked at him. There was a full conversation in that exchange that Aldred was not party to and did not need to be. No, Henry said, not to Evelyn, to the situation. Not this time. I'll go. Henry, Aldred started. I'll go, Henry said again with a finality that was not stubbornness, but decision, the difference between a man digging in and a man who has calculated and landed. Wichita is 3 days. I'll take Pruitt with me. His father surveyed that land in '61, and he may know more about the original transaction than he's told us yet. 2 sets of eyes on those bank records are better than 1. Aldred was nodding slowly. If you can get access to the original ledger, if you can document any inconsistency in the entry. I know what I'm looking for, Henry said. Evelyn looked at him. "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Can you send a telegram to Pruitt today?" "I'll go now," she said, and stood. Henry looked at her, the open, unmanaged look she'd learned to wait for. "Evelyn," he said. She paused. "I need you to go see Ed Harmon while I'm gone," he said. "Tell him everything. The deed challenged the judge, all of it. Don't wait." She nodded. "And stay away from Marsh," he said. "Henry." "I mean it," he said. It came out quieter than she expected, not commanding, not controlling. The tone of a man who is afraid of something specific. He knows what he's doing. He's been 3 steps ahead since before you got here, and he stopped. "Just stay away from him." She looked at him for a moment. "All right," she said. Not as concession, as recognition, because she heard what was underneath the request, and it was not distrust of her, it was fear for her, and those were entirely different things. She sent the telegram to Pruitt and was back within the hour. She went directly to the Gazette. Ed Harmon was a narrow man in his 50s with ink on his left hand that she suspected was a permanent condition, and the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent 30 years listening to what people say, and more importantly, what they don't. He led her into his office above the print shop, cleared a stack of papers from the chair across his desk without being asked, and sat back and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental attention of a man who was already interested. She told him everything. She told it the way she told everything, in order, with precision, without embellishment, because the facts were sufficient, and embellishment would give a careful man reason to discount her. She told him about the original boundary claim, about Daniel Pruitt, and Marsh's letter to him, about the accelerated hearing timeline, about Judge Croft and the money. She told him about the silent partner claim and the Wichita bank ledger. She told him about Marsh sitting in her kitchen with his folded paper and his calculated pause on the word acceptance. Harmon listened without interrupting. When she finished, he leaned forward and put both arms on the desk. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "how much of this can you document? Pruitt has Marsh's letter to him. Aldred has all the filed claims. The judge's connection to Marsh is, I can't prove it directly, but I know who can point you toward the people who can." "Who?" "Tom Wheeler at the feed store," she said. "He sees everything that goes in and out of the land office. He's been watching Marsh operate in this town for 15 years. If you ask him the right questions in a context where he feels safe answering them, I think you'll find he knows considerably more than he's said to anyone." Harmon looked at her for a long moment. "You've been in this town how long?" "7 weeks, she said. Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile, but was its neighbor. "Henry Carter," he said, "does not know what he accidentally acquired." "I beg your pardon." "I mean that as a compliment of the highest order," Harmon said, and pulled a fresh piece of paper toward him. "All right, Mrs. Carter. Tell me everything again from the beginning, and this time I'm going to write it down." She was back at the blacksmith shop by noon. Henry and Pruitt left at first light the next morning. She stood at the shop door and watched the stage disappear down First Street, and then went back upstairs and made herself breakfast alone for the first time since she'd arrived in Caldwell Falls. And the kitchen felt different without the sound of the forge below it. Not empty exactly, but lighter in a way that made her understand, in the same involuntary way you understand something you've been trying not to. How much of her daily framework had been built around the rhythms of another person. She did not find that frightening exactly. She found it clarifying. Which was for Evelyn Carter almost the same thing. She managed the forge days in the way she managed everything, systematically, without drama. She put a sign on the shop door, "Closed until Monday. Emergency ironwork, inquire Mrs. Carter." 3 people inquired. She handled 2 of them herself with the information Henry had left her. The third, a rancher needing a specific part she couldn't address, she wrote down and set on Henry's work table. On the second day, Clara Reeve came back. She arrived with a different basket and a less practiced smile, and this time the sweetness had been recalibrated. Something had shifted in her approach, less the performance of concern, more the genuine article, or something closer to it. She came in and sat at the kitchen table, and looked at Evelyn with the particular expression of a woman who has been reassessing something. "Gerald Marsh told Robert, my husband, that Henry was going to lose the property," she said, without preamble, which was new. He said it the way a man says a thing he already knows is true, not like he was predicting, like he was informing. "What did your husband say?" Evelyn asked. "He said it was a shame." Clara looked down at her hands. "Robert doesn't do well with conflict. He tries to stay out of things." She paused. "I told him that staying out of things is itself a choice, and that the town has been staying out of Marsh's things for long enough that he started to believe there are no consequences." Evelyn looked at her. "What made you say that?" "Watching you," Clara said without hesitation. "Since you got here, the way you—" She stopped, tried again. "There was something Marsh said when you were in Abilene. He was talking to a group of men outside the land office, and he was laughing, and he said something about how the Swedish woman had run off back to Chicago where she belonged." She looked at Evelyn directly. "And I stood on the boardwalk, and I didn't say anything, and I have been angry at myself about it since." The kitchen was quiet. "Clara," Evelyn said, "did you hear exactly what he said?" "Word for word," Clara said. "I have an excellent memory. Robert says it's a curse." She folded her hands on the table. "What do you need?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "I need a witness. Someone who heard Marsh publicly declare that I had left deliberately in a group before it could have been known. Because that's not gossip. That's a calculated act. And I need someone willing to say so to Ed Harmon." Clara was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then she said, "When? Can you go this afternoon?" "Yes," Clara said. And then quieter. "I should have said something sooner." "You're saying it now," Evelyn said. "That's what matters." Clara went to the Gazette that afternoon. Evelyn knew it had happened because Ed Harmon appeared at the shop door at 4 o'clock with ink on both hands now, and the expression of a man whose story had just gotten significantly better. "Marsh told 7 people you'd left," Harmon said without greeting. "Clara Reeve heard it. Tom Wheeler heard it. He came to me this morning, by the way, after you sent him to me. He's been keeping notes on Marsh's land office visits for 2 years. He's got dates, times, names of who went in with him. It's—" Harmon shook his head slightly. "It's a significant accounting." "Is it enough?" Evelyn said. "For the paper, yes. For the courthouse—" He paused. "That depends on what Henry brings back from Wichita." She thanked him and went back upstairs and sat at the kitchen table in the early dark and thought about Henry 3 days away in Wichita, going through bank records with Pruitt, looking for an inconsistency in a ledger that a careful man had had 31 years to construct. She thought about what it would mean if he didn't find it. If the ledger was clean, or clean enough to hold under scrutiny from a judge already committed to a verdict. If Aldred filed, and Pruitt testified, and Harmon published, and it still wasn't enough. She thought about it until she'd thought it through to the end, and then she put it away. She had learned somewhere in the long practical education of her life that the preparation for failure was a legitimate use of thought, but the dwelling on it was a waste, and she did not waste. She went to bed. She slept. She got up the next morning and managed the day. Henry and Pruitt arrived back on the 6th day, a full day earlier than expected, and she knew from the sound of the stage stopping the particular way Henry's boots hit the boardwalk, even from upstairs, with a weight and pace that were different from when he'd left, that something had happened. She was at the top of the stairs when he came through the door. He looked up at her. His face was different, not the blankness, not the controlled containment, something that was trying to be those things and not entirely succeeding. "Come down," he said. "I need to show you something." She came down. Pruitt was behind him, and between them they were carrying a leather satchel that had not gone to Wichita with either of them. It was old, the leather was worn at the corners, and the clasp was the kind that had been repaired once and would need repairing again, and it had a tag on the handle in faded handwriting she couldn't read from where she stood. "The bank in Wichita," Henry said, setting the satchel on his workbench. The ledger entry was exactly what Aldred said. Clean, dated correctly, Amount matching. The bank manager showed us the original, it's genuine. Hargrove's signature, Hargrove's account, the right date. He paused. We were there for 6 hours, looking for anything, any alteration, any inconsistency. There was nothing. Her stomach tightened. And then, Henry said, Pruitt asked the bank manager if there were any closed accounts from the same period, old records, anything associated with the Hargrove name. Pruitt stepped forward. He opened the satchel. He reached inside and removed a bundle of papers, old browning at the edges tied with a piece of twine that had once been red. My father kept copies, he said. I didn't know. I found them when I was pulling his field notes. I didn't understand what they were. He set the bundle on the workbench and untied the twine carefully. These are correspondence records between Caleb Pruitt and the land agent who handled your father's purchase, including. He found the paper he was looking for and held it out. A letter from the land agent dated 3 weeks after the purchase closed, referencing a payment made to Thomas Hargrove. Evelyn took the letter. She read it. Her pulse moved. What was the payment for? She said, even though she could already see it. Hargrove sold the mineral rights to a separate parcel 2 weeks before your father's purchase, Henry said. Different land entirely, different transaction. The deposit in his account, the one Marsh is using, was payment for those mineral rights. Nothing to do with my father's land. Nothing to do with any partnership. Hargrove had money in his account because he'd sold something else, and the amount happened to correspond, because the land agent had priced both transactions using the same regional rate per acre. The kitchen was very quiet. It's coincidence, Evelyn said. Genuine coincidence. Marsh didn't manufacture the ledger entry, he found it and knew how to use it. Yes, Henry said. Which means he found this letter too, she said. Or he found the record of the mineral rights transaction and understood it would exonerate you, and he... She looked up from the paper. He built the claim around the coincidence, knowing the exculpatory record existed and betting we wouldn't find it in time. That's what Pruitt said, Henry confirmed. Because most people wouldn't, Pruitt said quietly. The mineral rights record is in a closed file at a land office in a different county. My father's copy is the only other one, and no one knew my father kept copies of anything. Evelyn set the letter down on the workbench very carefully. We need to get this to Aldred tonight, she said. I sent a telegram from the Millhaven station, Henry said. He's expecting us. She looked at Henry. At the contained, precise face that was right now in this moment, showing something that had nothing contained about it. The specific expression of a man who had gone to Wichita afraid and come back with the thing that changes everything and was still absorbing the weight of the change. Henry, she said. He looked at her. You did it, she said. Pruitt did it, he said immediately. You went, she said. When you were afraid to go, when it would have been easier to stay and hope Aldred found something, you went. She held his gaze. That matters. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out, deliberate, unhurried, and he put his hand over hers where it rested on the workbench. Not a grip, just a placement. A weight. His hand was rough from the iron and warm from the cold outside, and he left it there for exactly as long as it took for both of them to understand what it meant, and then he picked it up and stepped back. Let's go to Aldred, he said. Aldred received them at his office, still open lamp burning coffee on the stove, as if he'd expected them to need it. And he read Pruitt's letter 3 times, each time more slowly, with the focused attention of a man reconstructing the legal architecture of a situation. When he finished the 3rd reading, he set the paper flat on his desk and looked at Henry. This dissolves the silent partner claim, he said. Completely. The deposit is explained and documented. Marsh has nothing. What about Judge Croft? Evelyn said. Aldred looked at her. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that's the more complex question. He leaned back. With Pruitt's letter, with the original survey records, with the mineral rights documentation, Croft cannot rule for Marsh without making his corruption so visible that it cannot be managed. There are limits even for a bought judge. A pause. But the limits only hold if the evidence is public before the ruling. If he can rule quietly before anyone outside this room knows what you've found. It won't be quiet, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. Ed Harmon knows everything, she said. Tom Wheeler's account, Clara Reeves' testimony, the full history of Marsh's claim and its timeline. I've been talking to him all week. She looked at Aldred. If you file tomorrow morning, and I walk directly from your office to the Gazette, Harmon can have a piece in print before the week is out. Judge Croft will know the town is watching before he picks up his pen. Aldred looked at her with the expression she'd seen on several people in the past weeks. The specific look of someone revising their assessment significantly upward. Henry, Aldred said, without taking his eyes off Evelyn. Your wife is a considerable person. I'm aware, Henry said, and she didn't look at him when he said it. But she felt it, the warmth of it, specific and unperformed, landing somewhere in her chest. Aldred filed at 8 the next morning. Evelyn was at the Gazette by 9. Harmon had the piece ready in 2 days. It ran on a Friday, which was the Gazette's highest circulation day, and it named names not recklessly, but with the precise and documented restraint of a man who had been saving this kind of story for a long time, and knew how to deliver it, so it could not be easily dismissed. It named the claim, the timeline, the ledger entry, and its documented explanation. It named Judge Croft's business relationship with Marsh sourced. Harmon made clear from county records and confirmed testimony. By Saturday morning, 3/4 of Caldwell Falls had read it. By Saturday afternoon, 2 men Evelyn had never seen before arrived at Aldred's office, lawyers from the county seat. She learned later sent by an administrator who had read the piece and understood its implications for the integrity of the county court. By Sunday, Judge Croft had recused himself from the hearing. Evelyn found out on Sunday evening from Aldred, who came to the shop with his coat still on, and the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for 3 weeks and has just been permitted to exhale. Croft's out, he said. The replacement judge is Margaret Hale from the Eastern Circuit. She has no connection to Marsh and a 20-year reputation for, he almost smiled, a pronounced dislike of fraudulent claims. Henry stood in the middle of his shop with his arms at his sides and said nothing for a moment. Then, it's not over. No, Aldred said. The hearing is still in 3 weeks. Marsh will still fight it. But he's fighting it now, without his judge, without his manufactured timeline, and against original documentation that directly refutes his central claim. He looked at Henry with the direct, honest gaze of a man delivering something he's earned the right to deliver. He's going to lose, Henry. He built this on a lie that happened to look like a truth, and you found the part that proves the difference. Henry looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. There was a long moment in which the shop was very quiet, and the lamp made its small, steady light, and Aldred had the good sense to examine something on his own coat sleeve. We should have supper, Henry said finally. We should, she said. They went upstairs. She made cornbread and beans, simple, the kind of meal that the occasion actually called for, rather than the kind that announced itself. And Aldred stayed, and Pruitt came, and the 4 of them sat around the table. That had been a table for one person for so long, it had forgotten it could hold more. And they ate and talked, and did not pretend the fight was finished, but allowed themselves for one evening to feel the weight of what had been recovered. After Aldred and Pruitt had gone, she cleaned up, and Henry sat at the table with his coffee and the quiet that had come to mean something different than it had 7 weeks ago, and she dried her hands and sat back down across from him. He looked at her. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I was in Wichita, he said, and we'd been through the ledger for 6 hours and found nothing. I sat in that bank office and I thought about... He stopped. Tried again. I thought about what it would mean to lose the shop, the building. I've thought about that before over the past months of dealing with Marsh. I knew what I'd lose. The forge, the work. The only thing I've built since... He stopped again. Since Margaret. She said nothing. But sitting in that bank in Wichita, he said, what I kept thinking about wasn't the forge. He looked at his coffee cup. I kept thinking about you sitting in this kitchen, waiting. He looked up at her. I kept thinking about having to come back and tell you we'd lost, and I didn't want to do that. Not because of the building, because of you." His voice was careful and direct, the way it always was when he was saying something that cost him. "Because somewhere between the 12 words in that advertisement and right now you became the thing I didn't want to lose." The kitchen was very quiet for a long time. Evelyn looked at him across the table at the iron dust and the gray at the temples and the face that had been closed for so long that this openness still looked like something painful and necessary, like setting a bone that had healed wrong and needed to be broken true again. "Henry," she said. "You don't have to," he started. "Henry," she said again, quieter. "I stopped wanting to be anywhere else a long time ago." She held his gaze. "I think you know that." He looked at her. Something in his face moved, not the quick, involuntary thing she'd seen before, not the near look, but the full thing, open and unmanaged and entirely real. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I reckon I do." Outside, the November wind was working at the building the way it always did, looking for the gaps, testing the frame. Below them, the forge had gone cold for the first time since she'd arrived. Henry had let it go tonight, for the first time, without going back down to tend it. She noticed that. She filed it in the same place she filed all the things worth keeping. She did not examine it too closely. She didn't need to. 3 weeks was not a long time. Evelyn had lived through longer stretches of uncertainty, the 11 weeks on the cot in Chicago, the 2 years after her mother's first illness, when every morning began with not knowing what the day would cost. And she understood that the quality of waiting depended entirely on what you did inside it. You could let 3 weeks hollow you out. Or you could fill them so completely that the hearing arrived before you'd finished what you'd started. She chose the second way. She always had. The garden plot behind the hen coop had been sitting turned and ready since October, and the first week of November brought 3 days of unexpected mild weather that she recognized as the last reasonable working days before the ground hardened for winter. She was out there every morning at first light, working in the cold with her coat on, and her breath making small clouds, building the cold frame she'd been planning since the day she'd arrived, and looked at that empty soil and decided what it was going to become. Henry came out on the second morning without being asked and held the frame posts while she hammered, and neither of them said anything about it being cold or early, or outside the terms of any arrangement either of them had ever discussed. He simply came out, and she simply handed him the post, and they worked side by side until the cold frames were standing solid and true. When they came back inside, he made the coffee. She noticed that too. The second week brought Marsh, not in person. Not anymore, not after the Gazette piece and Croft's recusal, and the county administrators who had made it quietly but unmistakably clear that the situation in Caldwell Falls was being observed from a level above the one Marsh usually operated on. He came instead through Harlan Greer, who appeared at Aldred's office with a revised offer not for the property this time, but a proposed settlement. Marsh would drop the deed challenge entirely. He would withdraw all filed claims. In exchange, Henry would sign a document acknowledging no wrongdoing on Marsh's part and agreeing not to pursue any legal action arising from the dispute. Aldred brought it to the kitchen table on a Wednesday evening and set it in front of them both. Henry read it once. He pushed it toward Evelyn. She read it twice. "He's afraid," she said. "Yes," Aldred said. "Not of losing the hearing," she said. "He expects to lose the hearing. He was always going to lose once Croft was gone." She looked at the document. "He's afraid of what comes after the hearing. If the record stands, if Judge Hale rules in Henry's favor on documented evidence of a fraudulent claim, that's a public legal record. That's something the county administrators can act on. That's something Ed Harmon can print as a follow-up piece." She set the document flat on the table. "He's not offering a settlement. He's trying to buy silence." Henry was looking at her with the steady, full attention that she had come to understand was his version of complete agreement. "What do you want to do?" Aldred asked Henry. Henry didn't look at Aldred. He looked at Evelyn. "What do you think?" he said. She looked back at him. "I think Gerald Marsh has been doing this to people in this town for a long time," she said. "And I think most of them didn't have Pruitt's letter, or Tom Wheeler's notes, or Ed Harmon. And I think if we sign that document, the next person he does this to won't have anything either." Henry turned to Aldred. "No settlement," he said. Aldred nodded, once picked up the document and put it back in his case. "I'll inform Greer," he said. "The hearing stands." After Aldred left, Henry sat at the table for a long moment. Then he said, "He's going to come after us for this." "He's already coming after us," she said. "I mean after the hearing, after he loses. A man like Marsh doesn't absorb a loss and move on." "I know," she said. "I want you to understand that," he said. His voice was quiet and direct. "I want you to know what you're staying in." She looked at him across the table. "Henry," she said, "I have never once in my entire life made a decision based on what was comfortable. I'm not going to start now." She held his gaze. "And I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did the thing it did. Sometimes the opening, the unguarded quality, and then he said very quietly, "Good." That single word in his voice with the weight he put in it landed somewhere in her chest and stayed there. The night before the hearing, she couldn't sleep. She lay in her room. She still thought of it as her room, still kept the key in the lock, though she hadn't turned it in weeks, and listened to the house and thought about the sequence of the last 2 months. The 12 words, the platform, the kitchen she had organized from nothing, the mended seam, the gray blanket set on the table without ceremony. The way Henry had looked when she came back from Abilene, the relief on his face that he hadn't managed to conceal in time. The hand over hers on the workbench, just the placement, just the weight. She thought about Margaret, who had left on a Tuesday without saying goodbye. She thought about what it had done to him, not the leaving itself, but the specific shape of it, the particular betrayal of a person who had chosen something else and couldn't be bothered to face him when she did. She thought about how a man rebuilds himself after something like that, and what it costs him, and what it takes to trust again when trust has been used as a tool against you. She thought about all of this until she understood it whole. And then she got up, because lying in the dark thinking was less useful than being at the kitchen table, and she went to the kitchen and lit the lamp and sat with her hands around a cup of water and waited for the morning. She heard his door at 4 o'clock. His steps in the hall, not toward the stairs, not toward the forge, toward the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the lamp. "You couldn't sleep either," he said. "No," she said. He came in and sat down across from her, and she poured water into the second cup and pushed it across the table, and he took it and held it, and neither of them said anything for a while. "I've been thinking about my father," he said eventually. She waited. "He built that forge," Henry said. "He dug the foundation himself. He was 43 years old, and he had nothing. He'd come from Ohio with my mother and nothing else, and he built it piece by piece over 2 years. And he told me once that the hardest part wasn't the work." He paused. He said the hardest part was believing it would still be standing when he was done, that something he built with his own hands could last. The lamp made its small sound. Outside the dark was the particular dark of the hour before any light begins. "It's still standing," Evelyn said. "Because of you," he said. "If you hadn't come, if I'd gotten someone else from that advertisement, someone who didn't know what questions to ask, someone who didn't go to Abilene." He shook his head. "Marsh would have had it by Christmas." "You would have found another way," she said. "No," he said, simply, without self-pity. "I wouldn't have. I would have fought until I couldn't, and then I would have lost, and I would have told myself it was the building and not—" He stopped, looked at the table. "I didn't know what I was missing," he said. "That's the thing. I put that advertisement in the paper because I needed someone to keep the house. I didn't know." He stopped again, and she waited, and when he looked up, his face had the full openness on it, the door that didn't open easily open. "I didn't know I was that alone," he said. "Until you were here, and I wasn't anymore." The kitchen was very still. Evelyn set down her cup. She looked at Henry Carter across the table at the man who had handed her the gray blanket without explanation and held the frame posts without being asked and made coffee for the first time on a cold November morning. And she said, "When I read those 12 words in Chicago, I thought I was making a practical decision. I thought I was choosing stability over uncertainty. I thought I was being rational." She paused. "I had no idea I was coming here." He looked at her. "Here," she said again, meaning the kitchen, the house, the table between them, all of it. Henry reached across the table. Not the hand over hers of the workbench, different than that. He reached across and she put her hand forward and he took it properly. His fingers around hers, and held it with the careful, deliberate certainty of a man who has decided something and is no longer uncertain about the decision. They sat like that until the sky began to change outside the window. Then Henry said, "We should get ready." "Yes," she said. He let go of her hand. He stood. He looked at her for a moment, with that expression, the open one, the real one, and then he went to get ready for the most important day his property had faced since his father built the forge. And she sat for one more minute at the kitchen table in the early light with her hand still warm from his, and felt with a completeness she had not felt since before her mother died, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The courthouse in Caldwell Falls was a single-story stone building on 3rd Street that smelled of wood polish and old paper, and the specific solemnity of a place where consequential things happened. It was full by the time they arrived. Evelyn had not expected that, had not prepared for the particular quality of walking into a room where half the town had come to watch. She felt the attention when they came through the door, felt it settle on them, and she straightened without thinking about it, not in defiance, simply in the automatic posture of a woman who had been looked at her whole life and had long ago decided that looking back was the only dignified response. Henry walked beside her with his hand briefly at her back as they moved through the crowd to the seats Aldred had held, and she felt 3 separate people change their expressions when they saw that gesture, small, unannounced, proprietary, in the most fundamental sense, and she filed all 3 of those expressions away without comment. Gerald Marsh was already seated at the opposing table. He was dressed better than anyone else in the room, which was a statement, and he did not look at them when they came in, which was also a statement. Harlan Greer sat beside him with his case files, and the particular expression of a lawyer who knows the ground has shifted under his client, but is professionally committed to the performance of confidence. Judge Margaret Hale arrived exactly on time. She was a compact woman in her late 50s, with the kind of posture that announced she had never once in her professional life allowed the size of a room to be larger than her authority over it. She looked at both tables with equal calibrating attention. She did not smile. She sat, organized her papers, and said, "We'll begin." What followed was 3 hours that Evelyn lived through with the focused moment-by-moment attention she brought to any situation she couldn't control and therefore needed to understand in real time. Aldred was precise and methodical. He built the case the way Henry built ironwork, piece by piece, each element fitted to the next, nothing decorative, everything load-bearing. Pruitt testified and produced his father's original field notes, and the letter documenting the mineral rights transaction, and answered Greer's cross-examination with the patient specificity of a man who had his father's meticulous records behind every answer. Greer fought. She had expected him to fold given the documentation, but Marsh had clearly told him to spend every minute he had, and Greer was a professional, and he spent them. He challenged the provenance of Pruitt's documents. He questioned the chain of custody of the mineral rights record. He argued that coincidence could operate in both directions, that the existence of the mineral rights transaction didn't preclude a separate investment by Hargrove in the Carter land purchase. It was, Evelyn thought watching from the gallery, actually a credible argument given the absence of a judge who was already committed to the other outcome. In a different courtroom, against a different set of documents, it might have held. But then, Aldred called Tom Wheeler. Tom Wheeler was 48 years old and had owned the feed store across from the land office for 22 of them, and he was the kind of man that people had stopped seeing clearly because he had been in the same place doing the same thing for so long that he had become part of the background. He sat in the witness chair with his hat in his hands, and answered Aldred's questions in the plain, direct way of a man who has been waiting to be asked and is relieved to finally be answering. He had 2 years of notes, dates, times, names, descriptions of who had entered the land office with Marsh and how long they'd stayed. 3 separate visits by a man he identified as the surveyor Marsh had used for the competing boundary claim 6 weeks before the claim was filed. Harlan Greer entering the land office with Marsh 4 days before the silent partner claim was submitted. And 1 entry dated 6 months ago that made Judge Hale look up from her notes for the first time with an expression of sharpened attention, a meeting between Marsh and Judge Elias Croft in the land office after closing hours, witnessed by Wheeler from the feed store window. The room changed when Wheeler said that. Not dramatically, not the way rooms change in stories with gasps and murmurs. More subtly than that. More like the quality of the air shifting. Like everyone in the room drawing a breath at the same moment and holding it. Greer objected. Hale overruled him with a precision that suggested she had been waiting for the objection and had already decided. She asked Wheeler 3 follow-up questions herself, which Evelyn noted was unusual, which Aldred had told her meant something significant, and Wheeler answered all 3 with the same plain directness. Marsh at the opposing table was very still. She had not seen him still before. She had seen him confident and performed and deliberately gracious and quietly threatening. But she had not seen him still, and the stillness told her something that 3 hours of testimony had been building toward. He had known when he walked into this room that he was going to lose. He had come anyway, because men like Gerald Marsh did not concede they made the other side prove it every inch in public on the record, because the proving cost something too, and he intended to collect whatever he could on his way out. Judge Hale ruled from the bench. She did not take it under advisement. She did not recess. She looked at both tables with the equal calibrating attention she'd brought to the room from the beginning, and she ruled. The deed challenge was dismissed. The boundary claim was dismissed. The survey records as filed by Caleb Pruitt in 1861 were affirmed as the operative legal description of the Carter property. All competing claims were found to be without merit, and she paused here in a way that was not accidental, potentially actionable, on grounds of fraudulent filing a matter she was referring to the county administrator for further review. She said all of this in the flat, precise language of legal ruling, and then she closed her folder and stood, and the room stood with her, and it was over. Henry sat very still for a moment after Hale left the bench. Aldred was already gathering papers, already turning to shake Pruitt's hand, already in the business-like motion of a man completing a job well done. The room was moving around them, people standing talking, the particular social noise of a verdict being absorbed. Henry turned to Evelyn. She looked at him. He said nothing. He reached up and put his hand along the side of her face just briefly, just for a moment, rough and warm and completely certain, and then he dropped it and stood up and shook Aldred's hand and thanked Pruitt, and was every inch Henry Carter, composed and functional and present. But she felt it for the rest of the day. The warmth of that gesture, specific and deliberate, and worth more than any prepared speech he could have made. Marsh left the courthouse without speaking to anyone. She watched him go from across the room, the broad back, the expensive coat, the hat replaced with the practiced motion of a man who does not allow himself to look diminished. He did not look at Henry. He did not look at her. At the door he paused. Just for a second, just long enough to be visible without being deliberate, and then he walked out. Harlan Greer, gathering his files, caught her eye across the room. He held her gaze for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately place, and then understood respect. Reluctant, unsolicited, and genuine. He nodded once. She nodded back. Then he left. Ed Harmon was outside the courthouse with a notebook. Judge Hale referred the fraudulent filing to the county administrator, Evelyn told him before he could ask. He was already writing. That means potential charges, he said. That's for the administrator to determine, she said. But it's on the record. It's on the record, she confirmed. He looked at her with the same expression he'd had in his office weeks ago. The revised assessment, the upward recalibration. Mrs. Carter, he said, if you ever want to write for the Gazette, the offer stands. I'll keep it in mind, she said. Henry at her shoulder said nothing, but she felt him almost smile. The weeks that followed were quieter than anything that had preceded them, and the quiet had a different quality than the quiet of before. Not the provisional, uncertain quiet of two strangers in a house together, but the settled quiet of people who have been through something and come out the other side of it, changed. Marsh did not come after them again. Not directly. The county administrator's review, which Ed Harmon covered in 3 separate pieces, each more specific than the last, had a containing effect on Marsh's appetite for aggression. He was not charged. Not yet, and perhaps not ever, because men with his resources rarely were. But he was visible in a way he had not been before, and visibility was its own kind of consequence for a man who had operated in the comfortable shadows of a town that had learned not to look directly at him. Harlan Greer quietly resigned from Marsh's retainer in December. Clara Reeve told Evelyn this over tea in the kitchen, which had become the setting for a different kind of conversation than their first meeting. Direct uncalibrated the conversation of 2 women who had decided to trust each other. The town is watching him differently, Clara said. Since the Gazette pieces, people are... She paused. People are braver when they see someone else be brave first. Evelyn thought about that. I wasn't trying to be brave, she said. I know, Clara said. That's why it worked. The forge continued. That was the constant. The thing that had been there before her and would be there after everything else changed. And it was she had come to understand not merely Henry's livelihood, but his language. The work he did in that forge was the truest expression of who he was, precise, patient, made to last, built to bear weight. She understood him through it in ways that conversation had only begun to approach. She understood other things too. In December, she planted the cold frames with winter greens and covered them against the hard freezes, and she started seeds in the kitchen window in small pots she'd found in the storeroom behind a box of old files. Henry watched her set them up one morning and said, "You're already planning spring." "I'm always planning spring," she said. "Even when it's winter," he said. "Especially then," she said. He looked at the seedlings on the windowsill for a moment. Then he looked at her with the full, unmanaged expression that she had stopped being surprised by, had started in fact to look for. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man assembling the right words, which with Henry meant assembling the true ones because he had no interest in the decorative kind. "The advertisement," he said. "The arrangement. I'd like to do it differently." She looked at him. "I'd like to start over," he said. "Not the marriage, not any of I don't mean that. I mean..." He stopped. Tried again. "I'd like to ask you properly. Not because you answered a newspaper and I needed a practical arrangement, but because..." He looked at her with the full weight of everything she'd learned to read in him. "Because you are the most necessary and the most remarkable, and you are the only person I have ever known who came into my life and made it larger instead of smaller." He held her gaze. "And I would like, if you're willing, to begin as if that's what this was from the start." The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn looked at Henry Carter, at the man who had posted 12 words in a newspaper and inadvertently told her the most honest thing she'd heard in years. At the man who had set a gray blanket on her table without explanation. At the man who had held her hand in the dark before the most important morning of his life and needed no other words to say what that meant. "Henry," she said, "I've been beginning that way since the second week." Something broke open in his face. Not the careful near smile, not the involuntary flicker, but the full thing, complete and unguarded, and he laughed. She had not heard him laugh before, a real laugh, not the controlled exhalation she'd occasionally seen, and it was low and surprised, and entirely unperformed, and it was the best thing she had heard in that kitchen. She was smiling before she decided to. She felt it happen, and didn't try to manage it. He reached across and took her hand properly the way he had in the dark before the hearing, and this time, he didn't let go after a minute. He held it across the kitchen table, in the December morning light, with the seedlings on the windowsill and the forge going below them, and said, "All right then," with the simple finality of a man who has found solid ground and intends to stand on it. "All right," she said. In January, Daniel Pruitt wrote to say that the county administrator had opened a formal inquiry into 2 other land transactions involving Marsh and the same surveyor he'd used for the fraudulent boundary claim. He wrote that 3 other families in the county had come forward after the Gazette pieces. He wrote that his father's records had been requested by the inquiry office and that he had delivered them personally, and that he felt for the first time since his father's death that the old man's careful work was being used the way it had been intended to tell the truth about the land. Henry read the letter at breakfast and passed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it and set it on the table, and they looked at each other. "Your father would have been glad to know," she said. Henry nodded once. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the window at the January sky, which was the flat, committed white of serious winter, and said, "He would have liked you." She considered that. "I would have liked him," she said, "given what he built." Henry looked at her. "The forge," she said, "and you." He was quiet for a moment. Then, Evelyn. "Henry, I love you," he said, simply, without preamble or ornament or the careful construction of a man managing the delivery. Just the words, plain and direct, the way he said everything true. She felt them land, felt the full weight of them, specific and solid in the place where the gray blanket and the hand on the workbench and the laugh she hadn't heard before had all been quietly accumulating. "I love you," she said back, just as simply, just as plainly. He nodded as if this confirmed something he'd been working toward for a while. Then he pushed back from the table and took his plate to the basin, a habit he'd developed somewhere in November without either of them marking the day it began, and rinsed it and set it on the shelf and pulled on his coat and went downstairs to the forge. She sat at the table for a moment with the letter from Pruitt and the coffee cooling in her cup and the seedlings on the windowsill leaning toward the winter light. And she thought about a woman who had read 12 words in a newspaper in an empty kitchen at 2 in the morning and made a decision that looked like practicality and turned out to be something else entirely. She thought about what it meant to cross an ocean at 19, looking for a life, and spend 13 years finding instead only the skills required to survive one, and then to step off a train in a small frontier town on a gray September morning and find in the most ordinary possible circumstances the thing she hadn't known she was looking for. Spring came the way it always came in Caldwell Falls. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in increments that accumulated until one morning you walked outside and the cold had a different quality, and the ground had softened, and the cold frames Evelyn had built in November were producing green things, small and deliberate, and absolutely certain of themselves. She was in the garden when Henry came out that morning. Not to help, just to stand near her, which was its own kind of language that she had learned to receive as fluently as any other. He stood with his coffee and watched her work, and the town went about its business on the other side of the fence, and the forge was waiting for him, and the day was beginning in all the ways days begin. "2 of the seedlings are ready to transplant," she said without looking up. "I'll dig the holes," he said. She looked up at him, then at the man who had posted a 12-word advertisement out of pure practical desperation, and had somehow, in the doing of it, asked exactly the right question to the exactly right person. And she felt standing in the cold spring morning, with her hands in the dirt, the complete, unambiguous, and utterly ordinary truth of what her life had become. She handed him the shovel. He took it and dug, and the morning opened around them both, certain and unhurried like everything real. Evelyn Carter had crossed an ocean looking for survival and found in 12 plain words posted in the back of a newspaper by a man who didn't yet know what he needed, the one life she had never thought to ask for, and she had built it as she built everything with her own 2 hands, and the refusal to leave before the work was done.